Hi everybody, welcome back. This is instructor Phil Demetriadis, and today we're going to begin the part of a two-part demo. I've had some people inquire about wanting to know how to draw organics and get involved with organics inside environments. Before we do that, this sort of applies to the basic drawing class for entertainment arts for us to talk about some understanding of basic shapes and what's happening inside the organic realm. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I have this little folder here, and what I want to do is I want to show you a couple of basic approaches of what we're going to start to do. And I have to give some credit to this. This is the first time I've been able to sort of go over this class here at school with you guys. But I did have, there are two people that made a huge impact on me in terms of drawing and thinking in organic mentalities. The first person is Robert Miller, who was an old basic drawing instructor here at Fullerton College. And he was really precise about drawing, and we used to come to class every day and just draw on big sheets of paper, and we would draw everything. He had a bag of props, which we're going to get to a little bit later. And he would have everything from still life objects, hard edge objects, organic objects, and we got to the point where we were cranking out like 2 to 3 big images a day. And then we're even rendering and lighting them as well. And that's something that we'll be working on. The other person I want to mention, I did not have a class with him, but he's basically took a lot of what I learned back in the late 80s, and he's applied it in his own method. And his name is Peter Hahn. He teaches over at Concept Design Academy, and he has a class in dynamic sketching, okay, which is really, even though it's dynamic sketching, I prefer to think of it as like just good old-fashioned basic drawing principles on draftsmanship. So a lot of the principles we're going to talk about today, some of them are also covered back in the Creative Illustration book by Andrew Loomis, okay? So what we're going to start to get into is basically this, okay? We're going to start drawing a series of organics, and we're going to start talking about how to wrap our shapes with rubber bands, okay? And how to wrap lines around them so they feel tangible and they have a three-dimensional purpose in front of us, okay? Now, this might look easy for you, but if we throw a horizon line in there, okay, then it changes everything, okay? So if you think about this, if you look at this example here, do you see how this feels like it could be a tree? Okay, can you imagine these being rocks, okay? We're going to start off, we're going to do 5 pages again this week, okay? Our first page, we're going to get into, and I'll label this on the blog for you. We're going to start with just basic organics with no horizon line. Then we're going to go in, and today I'll do a little bit of a drawing demo for you where I'm going to draw a horizon line. I'm going to come back in, and then I'm going to start wrapping different shapes that are all in relationship to a particular perspective, whether it be 1 point or 2 point, okay? And basically, this is sort of the direction that we're going to move into, is we're just starting with really base, simple organics. And now there's going to be something common. This is the way that I prefer to think. I got this from Mr. Miller. I like to think that every object that I draw that is organic based has a form of what I call a line of action. So if you guys have had figure drawing, a line of action is the one constant movement line that starts with the head ball of the figure and continues down through the spine and through one of the legs. For some people, that line of action can end up being down to the support leg that is holding the body straight. But to me, part of the line of action is also part of the gesture, where if I move my right leg over to the far side like this, and I'm angling my body, that line of action is now going from my head, and it is the longest line that is curving through the parts of my drawing, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with this sort of basic, and I grabbed a couple samples here just to show you. I'm going to flip through some of these. Let's go to, let's jump over here. Actually, let's go to that last. That had some organics in it. Here we go. Here's another page of full-fledged organics, okay, that we're going to be looking at here, okay? A variety of different shapes. Now, you're going to have single shapes, and then you can combine other shapes together, okay? Where this is going to lead us is that once you get pretty crafty at this, and you've done it for a little bit, it shouldn't be that hard, okay? Then, once you start to do it with a horizon line inside the piece, what happens is if you take that mentality and you start to block out and apply that to given organic animals, okay? Then all of a sudden we start to talk about having some really realistic outcomes and some great drawings, okay? So let me show you a couple other examples here really quickly. All right, This is where we will end up at, okay? Here, let me grab, I had this image here. These are tall images. Sometimes you can't zoom into them correctly. Let me just see if I can bring these up for you guys here. I was trying to look around on Pinterest and go for some good examples here, but these are sort of stacked together. Let me see if I can zoom in, if we can see these. Okay, so, oops. That's what I was worried that would happen. Let's try that again. All right, let's go back to this one. Sorry, guys. There we go. Okay, so here's a great little organic page right there. Do you see that? Series of shapes. I'm going to draw a couple for you. And so I'm going to use the term gesture line and wrapping shapes with rubber band and drawing through those shapes. Okay? Once you get sort of a hold of this, the next phase is when we start taking these organics and we start applying other little elements, little detail elements on top of them or around them, okay? And we're also going to talk a little bit that line of action that I talked about, that gesture line. That to me, that's also like a center line. Every object that you draw, and I already covered this a little bit before, should have a given center line on it. The center line is a way of dividing up your shape. It's a way for you thinking about an x-axis and a y-axis, and then you have a z, which is your depth. I'll cover that in a minute when I start drawing for you guys. Okay, so I'm going to take some of this information. I'm going to put it up on the blog for you. Okay, so you can take a look at it. Look, geometric forms, additive, subtractive. Okay, arrows. Okay, this is the next part of what we're going to start talking about is right here. Okay, this is something that I've seen that Peter Hahn does in his classes. Okay, and I actually covered part of this back in the day with Robert Miller. And when Robert Miller talked about this, we didn't go as in depth. And what I like about what Peter Hahn has done is he goes really in depth into his class and he talks about all types of surface textures. We're going to make these gradient passes like this, okay? So in these gradient passes, they're also known as like texture studies, okay? Because basically what happens is you guys are drawing and you have a series of objects and form that you have represented inside a two-dimensional space, okay? All right, that two-dimensional space is a flat piece of paper that doesn't really exist, okay? So you're drawing objects that don't exist like the objects that you see in front of you. So after you've drawn your objects in form, with wrapping them with rubber bands and gesture lines, you have to be able to go back and you have to look at your objects and you have to understand the surface texture of the object. Why is that important? Because in order to properly jump into rendering and to understand how to render objects, and this is the same thing with being an environment designer or being a conceptual artist in a digital painter, is you have to understand the makeup of the surface texture. Okay, and the purpose of us doing these texture studies, we're going to do quite a bit of these because I want you to think about all the variant textures that are out there. And if you do that, I guarantee you right now, this is going to make you a much better artist and a better designer, especially when preparing for you to go into digital painting, as compared to students that are sitting in a basic drawing class somewhere else where they're not considering and coming up with all these textures, okay? So really quick, some great examples here. Let's jump over to this student piece here. And what's going to happen is we're going to then go through and we're going to start to draw some organics ourselves. I will walk you through this and do another demo where I start to draw rocks and waterfalls and trees, okay? I'm also going in another demo, okay, I'm going to show you this technique here of working on tone paper and then coming back in and using a little white to bring out some highlight with a dedicated pen, and you get this really fantastic outcome right here. So remember in the sketchbooks, I told you guys when you grab your sketchbooks, what's the first comment I made for you to do?
Make a texture.
No, go for tone paper, remember? I said, yeah, and that's what you meant there, Connor, right? And exactly, and I told you guys, get a sketchbook with toned paper. There's a reason for that. And then some people went for the white sketchbook. Well, I know what to tell you. There's a reason why we want toned sketchbooks, and this is part of the reason. Your ability to draw will completely change when you have the ability to come in and add white highlights, because the tone of the paper will act as a neutral tone for the object, and then being able to come and put white like this on the side, okay, will allow it to pop. There are a couple different ways that you can add white into an object. One way is that you can use a gel pen. A second way is that you can use a Prismacolor pencil that's white and very soft edge, okay? Another way is there are some people, if you look around, there are these little whiteout pens. So you guys know what whiteout is, right? Old school days where you used to go over stuff, right, that you drew with a pen. So there are some thin whiteout pens and thicker pens. Sometimes you can use some of that. And then the last way, by the way, the whiteout highlights, that's like a little golden secret. We used to do that in animation for doing conceptual art and environments. We'd come back and white out a super bright white. It's very hot. So we would come in and we would push that onto a traditional drawing, and it would make a very bright highlight. It would get the eye to pop at a particular location. Okay. The other way is gouache. You can pick up, and I have some gouache. I use it all the time when I'm out sketching, is I have a little tube of gouache. I have a little, like a butter tray lid, you know, and I open that, and I have a little portable water container, and I put 1 or 2 drops of gouache. I squeeze a little bit of water, and I take a little watercolor brush, and I sit there, and it lasts forever. And I can just go along and paint white highlights inside my sketchbook, and I get fantastic results, okay? But we're going to be drawing some of this, okay? So here, if you look at these organics, okay, just like we did before with our basic props, they are tier 1 through like tier 5 organics, okay? We're going to start with some really basic shapes, which is what I just showed you a couple minutes ago. We're going to be starting with some of this, okay? But I also want to show you where we're going to be moving to. So if we come over here and we start looking at some more, for example, let's grab some of these, right? Organic flowers, organic plants, looking at big giant trees, okay? That's a perfect example of a wonderful wedge-shaped tree, right? I know that's been trimmed, but we're going to get to that in just a little bit. That type of a plan, right? Working with this. Now, the great thing about this, I'll cover every one of these images a little bit later. All of these images are predicated upon what, folks? What are we looking at when we're staring at these? Right, very close. Cubes. We're talking about images that already exist inside a perspective plane. This tree is inside a world, and somebody took a picture of it, and there's a dedicated horizon line in there. Okay, so one of the secrets I'm going to tell you up front right now, one of the secrets about really understanding how to draw organics correctly is understanding the perspective in the core primitive shape that the organic exists within. Okay, so if we get a good idea that, hey, there's a base here, I can look on top of this, I have a horizon line about here, and if I look at the way these leaves and plants are moving upward, they're going above my horizon line, therefore I'm going to see under those leaves. Okay, it's the same thing here. If I take a look at this tree, do you see how we can start to see underneath the base of part of this right here? Okay. Well, that means that the horizon line is a little bit lower and we're able to see above part of that tree. That's a huge part to understanding how to draw organics. Then, now let's leave the discussion of the core primitive and let's move back and talk about texture for a second. Look at the texture of that. What would you call that? And by the way, I love coming up with silly names for texture, because I talk about it all the time, especially when I get into digital painting with students. I make comments like, let's just talk about texture real quick. What are some different textures? While we're doing that, let me move over, and I'm going to grab another texture sample here for you. Okay, here's a pretty good one right there. Okay. I found this on Pinterest. This is done by Nicholas Amorsi. Okay. And this is from Peter Hahn's class. Okay. Week 2, them talking about textures. Okay. So real quick, what are some basic textures?
Fuzzy.
Fuzzy, great texture. How would you draw fuzzy then? Series of lines. Okay, here's one I talk about all the time. I talk about orange peel, like an orange texture. That's actually referred to when people work on walls. There are different texture surfaces for spray painting drywall. It's not spray painting, but for texturing drywall. So there's an orange peel, which is, and I used to do construction when I was going to college, right? So orange peel is when you just spray a sort of a watery coat. And then, by the way, that's what they tend to use in Chicago and on the East Coast. In California, since we have humid conditions that change and we have hot and cold, we tend to get wall pops that come out of the wall. Because of that, we use a really thick texture. Okay, so I worked with a couple guys. They have different names for it, but it's basically like They call it a blobby texture. What they do is they spray like blobs on the wall and they smear it with a flat instrument, and then it creates this really thick texture. Okay, and if you were to push that up a notch or two, you get into what they call faux finish texturing. Okay, but I like to think of objects that have that. So here's a great example of going through and thinking about different textures. Okay, we have grass textures. We have textures on, think of like carpet. There are different types of carpet. You have circular textures. There are square pattern textures, right? When's the time you might see a square pattern or rectangular texture?
Tiling.
That's right, tiling. What about on rocks? If you're drawing rocks. Rocks have all different types of texture. Have you guys ever seen sandstone? Sandstone rocks have curved finishes to them, okay? There are other rocks out there that are going to be more jagged edge and rough. When I went to Hawaii and got to look at lava, there are different types of lava. Some lavas are very smooth, and they have like linear lines inside them. They almost look like a chunk of like melted marble, okay? And then there's some lava that are much more gritty, that are much more angular, depending on the type of stone that there was. So as we start looking at textures, one of the things that I need you guys to do is start considering what are some varied things that are around you, okay? What about, now there are some things we can't see. That could be a whole lecture in itself, talking about texture and zooming in with a microscope, right? But here's a great example from it I found online too on Pinterest. I was just looking for some examples. And then I'll cover some examples for you when I do the demo. Okay, so what about textures that are displaced against other textures? Like raised and lifted textures. So have you ever felt something like rust? Wrap your fingers across it. Rust is when water is hitting parts of metal and it's creating an oxidation phase, and then the rust sets in, and the rust starts to permeate and it blends with the oxygen and it raises above the surface of the paint. Does that make sense? Can you almost feel that as I describe it, right? So we talked about orange peel. What about if you had, now here's something neat. Imagine if your eyes were closed, okay, and you were looking at feeling a banana and feeling an orange. Can you feel the difference? The banana is very smooth, right? But what happens when you peel the banana? I know it's gushy, but if you run your fingers along the tip of the banana, it has sort of these little indentations on part of it, right? What about looking at an orange and a cantaloupe? A cantaloupe is a very similar texture, but it's a little bit more raised on it. Does that make sense? Okay. What about a pineapple? Okay, a pineapple is very tough and very rigid on the outside, and they're literally in shapes of like little diamonds, if you were to look at that surface texture. I'll do another lecture for you when we get more in depth into textures. For now, I want to go over and just start talking about drawing in just a second here. Okay, so what I'm going to do on the blog is I'm going to put up a series of base elements for you to look at and to consider. Okay, one of these is going to be basic fish. Okay, these are a great way to work right now, and the reason why fish are so great is because they have a variety of textures on them. Do you see right here? Do you see the thick scales on the side of the fish? And then look at right here what happens. The scales get much thinner, and then they almost, as they wrap around the edge of the form right here, what happens to the tail of that? It blends in, and then they have these fins, and the fins are now a smooth texture that are almost like little ribs of hair with webbing around them, right? So that fin becomes very fluid and gestural all of a sudden, and there's a totally different texture variant that's on there. Okay? So if we look at a variety of different fish, and by the way, I just put these up for our lecture. I have some other examples of fish. If you were to like look at a marlin, you were to look at a tuna, you were to look at an eel, and you start looking at the difference in the surface quality. Okay? But this is a great way to work when you start thinking about how textures are working and how they're applying here. And I really think, by the way, I just got to love these goldfish too. Okay? Goldfish are innocent and they're sweet and everybody loves them. Okay? But the thing about goldfish is that, and everybody in here had a goldfish, didn't they? No, you didn't? Do you know anyone that ever got drank and swallowed a goldfish? I do. Okay. All right. So look at, even on some of the goldfish on the head, they get this round, like bumpy, formatted texture up here. They have this scale texture that thins out up to here, and then up to here you get these flowing linear lines that are on there. That's why I think they're so great. Also, something else that's really fantastic to draw are just basic flower shapes. Okay, really great organic, because the tip of the flower leaves themselves, the petals, versus the leaves that come from the growing of the plant, they're two different texture variants. Okay, these tend to be very round, and sometimes they even have little sticky hairs that come out of it. Does anyone know why the petals would have that? To catch water and moisture, because they're designed that way by nature. So in the morning, when it's cold mornings, okay, they can actually catch. Have you ever looked at a plant in the morning? Everyone ever seen a garden or have plants, and you go out and look at them, and there's little droplets that are on there? Those little droplets allow the plant to get proper moisture for it to grow. Okay, so but if you look at that and you look at the curves that are on here, look, and you feel this, it almost feels like a soft wrinkled paper. Okay, do you see that? Okay, so and then if you were to look at these leaves, they're totally different. Some of the leaves can be very hard-edged, okay? Some can have a pattern to them. So if I were to make the comment of like a lizard scale, okay? All right, you could picture drawing that on there. And if I come down and look at that type of leaf, it's going to be totally different. So why is this important, okay? Well, you know what? Here's a perfect example. Hold on, let me pull up an image here real quick. Why is this example? Why do we need to understand our basics here? Okay, I was going to show you a video from Peter Hahn a little bit later. If any of you ever have a chance, he's over at Concept Design Academy, like I mentioned, and a good friend of mine, Patrick Ballesteros, took a lot of classes with him, and he just swore by him. He said, you go in there with a positive attitude, and there's nothing, you're always going to learn something new. You're practicing on your craft, and you're working around somebody who's another professional who really, really loves to draw. So it just brings it all to a higher end. Okay, I'm going to show you a piece by Armand Serrano. Armand Serrano, super nice guy, okay? And he worked over at Spa Animation. He's worked at Disney Features for quite a while. And when he was over and he was working on, hold on, I'm looking for one of his good organics. Armand Serrano from, here we go. Click this and see if we can get this a little bit larger. Aha, perfect. Actually, let me drag that to the desktop real quick, and then we can come back, okay, and take a look at, let me grab just a couple of different images here for you, okay? So Armand Serrano was working on Surf's Up, okay? Armand Serrano. Why would this be important? Why do we have to have a really good, solid understanding of texture and understanding texture variants and how they work inside locations? Well, I'm about to show you. Okay. Close that off. So, I got a black image there. This is why it's so important, okay? When you get to a point, some of you are like, okay, yeah, I'm in basic drawing now. It's sort of simple. It's easy. I'm sort of stringing by. Well, guess what? That's the next phase right there, folks, is when you start combining all your drawing and your textures, and you start using foreground, midground, and background. You start overlapping shapes to tell and to create worlds in three-dimensional views. Then you start to incorporate a character in there, and then you start to tell stories. That's part of what we do as entertainment artists, is we are storytellers. We like having the ability to come up with things that nobody's ever seen before, draw them out of our head, put them on a piece of paper, put a character in there for scale reference, and come up with ideas for trees. Okay, look at these stylized plants here, how they're in shapes of triangles. Okay, look at this tree. I'm going to call it a knotty looking tree, meaning knots, not that it's been in bad behavior, but knots of big, round, bulbous sort of shapes overlapping each other, where it almost looks like a series of like bumps and muscles all grouped together, okay? So if we come back over here and we start taking a look, okay? Uh-oh. All right, we look over here. We look at some of the tree variations, some of the texture differences on the rocks. See how these textures just fade off back here? And then, by the way, how are we looking at this tree right now? Where's the horizon line? The horizon line's down low. Okay? The horizon line's down about here. We can see underneath that tree. That's really, really imperative and important for being able to figure that out. Okay? Let's look over here. Look at, I know it's a little harder to see. I wish I can get my hands on some of the large originals. Look at the texture variant that's happening here in these foreground elements. Okay? Look at how this becomes a softer texture. Okay? You'll start to notice that when you look at a lot of his drawings, look at how the rocks are treated. Okay, look at how their edging and their texture variants are. Okay, all this is really, really important, and that's where what we're doing in this class, that's what this is leading us to. Okay, all right, so what I'm going to do really quick, let me sit down for you guys, and I'm just going to sketch for a little. Okay, pull back up Sketchbook Pro. Okay, so phase 1 for you guys. And you know what's funny is that every time I've gone over this information, or whenever I get a student, sometimes I have students that skip classes where they don't take a class like this, and they jump right into like a more advanced class, like environment sketching, and then they get to trees and plants, and they just sort of fall apart, and they can't figure out, like, you know, what's happening or how come what they're drawing isn't really working. And the first thing that I start to do is I have to go back and start talking to them about understanding the shape and how the shape exists. Okay, so this is what I like to do when I sketch. I like to start with like a rough line, and I sort of just throw, remember I talked about that gesture line. I start with a basic shape. I like to start with a circle, and I like to think of my organic shapes existing. Hold on a minute. My brush is really light. There we go, that's better. Okay. I just come over here and I just start to throw some shapes down. Okay, and you see how I already threw the center line right in here, okay? It enables me to think about where the center of a particular object is. That way I can come back and I could wrap my object like this, and I could wrap and figure out and draw through the shape and figure out what's happening on the opposite side. So then I could come back over here and I could do the same thing. So then if I want to keep working on my object and I want to pull anything out, this is how I tend to think, where maybe I might come in right here. I might decide, okay, I'm going to grab a leg and pull a leg off of here. So as I wrap this particular line around here, what I'm doing is I'm coming back in, throwing another line, thinking about my shape and the thickness of my shape, and then I come back in here and I sort of collect these, match these lines back up together, and then I sort of wrap them again with another center line, having a good idea of what's happening and how these elements are overlapping and working together in terms of shape and form. Okay, so now if I come back over here, I'm going to do the same thing. I have a center line that's in here. Okay, I'm going to come over. So this is sort of your first page and your first important step that you have to do is you have to get a good understanding of these elements, center lines, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail in a minute about the X, Y, and the Z axis. Okay. Okay, the center lines are really, really important for me because they allow me to put cross-connecting lines. Okay, so now I'm going to mention real quick, I think it'd be a good time to talk about the X, Y, and the Z axis. Okay, so I hate to bring this up and sound so technical, but I learned this in Maya way back in the day in 2000 when I was working for Big Idea, which are the VeggieTale people, right? They asked me if I wanted to learn Maya, and I had the opportunity to get trained by this really amazing artist his name is Dennis Brado, who's now head of texturing and rendering at Sony ImageWorks, okay? And one of the things that Dennis taught me real quick is you always, and he came from a drawing background as well, he actually lives here in Fullerton too, we talked a little bit about this, of understanding this. You have the x-axis, you have the y-axis, and then you have what we call the z depth. The z depth is that direction in space where you're adding depth to a particular object. The reason why this is so important to think about is that a lot of times when students are drawing, they're not thinking about, they end up drawing characters or animals or things like this. They end up drawing like, let's say like an elephant, and they come in here, and they always end up in side views, and they're never really thinking about the X, Y, and the Z axes, right? So one of the problems is in drawing is that if we start thinking about the fact that if we have an x-axis and a y, so if I look at this, let me draw on this with another layer here, and I'm going to switch to red really quick, okay? So if I start thinking of what I'm doing right here, if I think of this as my x-axis, right? Where's the y-axis then? My y-axis is always going to be, okay, let me get to another color. Purple right here. Okay, does that make sense? So look at what I drew there. If x is always across, y goes up and down, and then z has the depth in it, right? So do you see here, this would be my x right here. This would be my y going down. Sorry, I made it look like an x, and this is my z. That's my depth that's taking place. Do you see how quickly I figured that out in my head? I'm always thinking about that when I'm drawing. Okay, let me take that off real quick. All right. The reason why is when I come back in here and I'm sketching is that I'm always coming back in and asking myself what's on the other side and what's the depth. So if I come over here and if I take a line, I want to draw a leg over here on this other side, okay? So I already drew through part of the shape right here, and I figured out where that line goes, and I gave it a little bit of depth right here. I can come over and I could figure out that this leg on the other side is going to be coming out of a shape about yay thick. You see that? Okay, yes sir, Daniel?
Is this along the same lines, like the X, Y, and Z thing? Is that like is it on the same lines as that, like if you were in Blender and you saw those arrows of it?
Yes,
It's the
yes.
same thing?
So in Blender you'll see it, in most 3D softwares you'll see it, and you have this little indication. But you see the importance of applying that into drawing. It allows me to think about what are the shapes that are happening and how I can draw through my objects and my elements, okay? Because I know right now, as I'm drawing on this particular shape, okay, I know where I'm thinking of this as, hey, that's my X, going up and down is my Y, and if I receive this element back, it's going into a Z, okay? So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm just sort of drawing through my shape here. I'm following my lines, I'm going to the other side, like so, and then I'm drawing legs out, okay? Now, do you guys remember me talking about the principle of the top of a house? Okay, remember I talked about that if I have the middle of a building that's my house, and if I have a line that comes down the middle of that house, and if I have an angled roof, if my roof is this angle, all I have to do is find this key point right here, and then I draw the other side, right? Well, what happens when my house does this? And I'm going to have a flat tip to my roof, but then an angle, right? All I have to do is draw the angle and then draw a dotted line to that middle point right there, and then follow that, and then bring that back through the other side, and then I get the other angle to my house. Does that make sense? Okay? The reason I'm showing that for you is that when I'm doing my drawing here, if I want to figure out where the other leg is coming through, or an appendage that is being extruded out from part of my object, I can go back and I could use that same theory in a philosophy. Give me a second, I'm going to draw it for you right here. Okay? Okay, so let me draw it on top of here with another layer. Okay, I'm going to use red so you can see it. So for example, here's my center line that's on the top, right? If I want to drop down from here, dot, 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 and find my center line underneath, my center line is going about right here. Do you see it? I'm going underneath that shape, and then it comes back up and wraps over the top. So imagine if I cut that shape, should even be a little bit lower. Sorry, I should have brought it a little bit lower, down to about there. Imagine if I cut that shape in half with a hot butter knife, right? I could find that center line. Then look at this. If I find the middle of where that circle is, you see that? And if I draw a line around here, and if I come over here and draw a line back through to the other side, you see I can find the angle of that leg, and if this is the center right here, it's going to hit about here. Do you see that? I'm drawing the top of that house roof right now. So then if I come back through here, through this point, it gives me a better idea. That would be the center there, and then I could draw that other leg this way. That way, if I come back into my blue, and I come back over here, okay, I can match up the blue legs. Does that make sense? What I just did there. How I drew through that to find the top of the roof there. Does that make sense? You guys hanging in there with me? Okay, so that's why we have the applied perspective class, which is a really detailed perspective class talking about elements like that. I'm just doing it for you really quick on a drawing. Now, you don't have to get that technical, but I want you to think about that if I want to draw a leg on the other side here, what I tend to do is find the center of those elements, draw a line across, find the center there, find the angle like this. So I just basically drew the top of my roof there. Then I come through here. Now I found the center of that leg. See that? Then I could come back here, draw a light line going across like this, and now I know the leg is going to end about right there. So then I just connect the top back through here. I connect this side through here. Okay, like that. All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this with a line. I'm going to draw through part of the shape so I can see what's happening in part of the form. Okay, and I'm going to come back here and do the same thing as well. Okay, so do you see how I figured that out really quickly? Okay, then I'm going to come back. Let's do it to the front here. I have this shape. It wraps down. It comes around. So if I look here, I'm just going to wrap a rubber band a little bit more around that shape. It's sort of coming up here, going over this way, and then drops down. And do the same thing for that end over here. So I know this circle over here is going to be like that. It's going to be sort of turned. Why? Because this surface right now is turning like this. So if I have a shape that's right here, and if I were to come over here and measure and draw that on the other side, like so, okay, that circle shape is going to be warping because it's wrapping around the form of the object. Does that make sense? Okay, it's the same principle if you were to draw the top of a barrel. Okay, when we have the top of a barrel, we have this, and the planks that are closer to you, oops, the planks that are closer to you are a little bit wider, right? And then what happens is as these wooden planks start to wrap around the corner of that barrel, they start to get tighter, like so. Because there's more distance happening between here and here. That distance from there to there, even though it doesn't look like much, from there to there, is the same distance from here to here. But this looks much greater, okay? This is much greater when we're looking at it because it's right in front of us. So when objects are turning or wrapping in shape and form and going away from us, the lines are going to get a little bit closer, and that's why this leg is getting sort of squashed right there, if that makes sense. Okay? All right, give me a second. Let's delete that. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to keep working on my little guy that I started sketching. Okay? And here I'm going to find that sort of center point of the object. I'm going to find it there. I'm going to draw a line between them, sort of find the middle, find that angle there. And then I got that angle sort of coming out on the opposite side. I'm going to draw another trace line down there. It's coming out. There. Oops, sorry. Got to get up and turn here. The Cintiq in the class does not rotate. If you ever buy a Cintiq, oops, no, I changed. If you ever buy a Cintiq, I would highly recommend not to get that big giant 28 monstrosity, which is the one I have here. The reason why is that it doesn't rotate, so you're constantly having to get up and move around the object. And the one thing I like about the Cintiq I have at home all the time, it's the 22 HD, and that thing rotates, okay? So there. Now do you see if I wanted to, I could keep drawing into the Z depth. I can keep adding some more elements to what I have. Oh, that's a trip. I accidentally turned on the, sorry. I accidentally turned on the mirror image in Sketchbook Pro, which is pretty cool. Okay, so now let's say that was one shape. Let's say I wanted to add to it, make like it could start to look like it's some type of sea creature if I wanted to, right? I don't even get to get that complex. I'm just going to come over here and just scribble out some basic shapes. Okay, oops, sorry to move. I'm going to come over here and what I'm going to do is sort of do this. So there's two ways I like to think of working on shapes. Okay? One way is I like to do this, where I think of the shape and I start from the ground. So in a lot of my drawing classes, especially the environment design classes, I'm always talking about the best way to draw environments is to find the grid and draw from the grid up. That's a little golden secret, right? Same thing here, I just threw a line down. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in here and start to throw lines that are wrapping over the form here like this. Okay, but I started from the base. You see that? I started from a line down on the bottom, and then by coming over here and wrapping lines over and across, oops, sorry, I had a little bit of slip there. Sorry, I need to get up and move. This is where I can't adjust my wrist. There we go, once I get up and start over. So you see what's starting to happen? Now I start to get a little bit more dimension on the shape because I'm going in here and I'm starting to wrap it with rubber bands and I'm starting to think about the thicknesses that are inside that shape, okay? There. Now I sort of cut that part in half, right? Now hold on, let me erase this interior line here, which I don't think I really need anymore. It was just a rough base, okay? And I'm just going to start coming back in here. I'm going to throw a center line in here and try to figure out what's happening to part of that form. Now, when I drew this really quick, I ended up with that little line right there, but I'm imagining now, here's my center line coming down here, dropping down that shape, hitting about here, and then curving back this way, okay? And the same thing back here. If I come back here, follow that dotted line, it's going to come down to there, and then that line's going to come here, and it's going to drop downward, okay? Like so. All right, and then I'm going to come back in here, do the same thing. I wrap this with a rubber band. Okay, do you see that? So it starts to give part of my drawing a lot more form and shape and sensibility, okay? And it's nothing complex, right? How did I start? I started from the ground and I worked up, right? Now here I have to adjust. I have that quick sketch in there. I have to figure out this isn't matching part of the contour line of the object right now. This is sort of coming down and then going to here. So I have to figure out, and I have this sort of curve in here. So maybe part of this body is flat like this. It wraps up over. Then this comes up and then starts to wrap over like so. So now I need to think about what I did is I made that mistake. I shouldn't have erased that interior line that I had. But I'm going to pretend this is part of it in the back that's here. Okay, so now I have this really organic shape. I'm going to come over here and draw a line that comes around here. That's going to come here and it's going to wrap around part of this. And as it gets up a little bit tighter, it's going to wrap around as well. Okay. Okay, there. Okay, see how I put that shape together? Base organic shape, right? So that's the first way. This was going to be called working from the ground up, okay? Now the other way, the other thing I started to do over here is I like to think of cutting through the shapes and drawing the circumference of them. So for example, what I can do here is this. I sort of imagine that I'm cutting sections with a hot butter knife, right? Like this. And then I just connect my lines together. So have you ever seen the subsections of an aircraft where they show you the supports of the aircraft? That's what I'm sort of doing here. Is see, look, now if I come over here and I come along these lines, okay, now I'm just going to come along and I'm going to wrap a line around the outside of these, okay? Okay, see how I did that really quick? Okay, I just did that thinking of the cross sections as if I had cut it with a butter knife, right? Now I could come along here and add in some more lines to figure out what's happening in terms of the particular shape and form of this object. So I could come in here and imagine this is some type of a very organic element, maybe, and then I have a center line that's running down like this. It's wrapping around here, it wraps underneath, and then part of that center line is coming back through here. Underneath the object, it's going back over to that little leg. Okay. Now here, as it wraps around, I'm not going to see some of it because it might curve down to about there. And then as it comes around that corner, okay, I might see just a little bit of that center line wrapping around to here and coming down, wrapping there. So now I could come over here and throw a little bit of a line wrapping through here, figure out what that shape is doing. Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to bring that line. I'm going to wrap a line from here, coming down, wrapping through here, up over this, and then wrapping back down around there. Okay? I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to bring another line coming this way, wrap it down and over. Oops. A little slip there. Like so. Okay? And then again, I'm going to start to wrap some lines over, define more of what that was crooked. That element is. I'm not used to, I spent the whole weekend drawing water buffaloes on my Cintiq. And I'm so much more used to that being a smaller size and the way it rotates than working with this, okay? All right, so look. Oops. Come on, where'd the cursor go? Sorry, someone put another mouse up here from the easel lecture. There we go, now I got my mouse back. So if I come in here and I start to look at what I've done, I have some really basic fun shapes here, right? Organic shapes, okay? So I want you guys to start sketching and thinking about this, okay? And then what we're going to do is I'm going to list on the blog, we're going to do a couple pages of these, which should be pretty easy. And then I'm going to have you go in and put a horizon line in and then start creating these organic shapes in relationship to the horizon line, okay? Do you want me to do a quick demo for you on that? And I'll talk about a tree real fast, okay? Before I do that, let me show you a little piece of gold. Okay? Back in the day, I was really lucky to get to take a class at a school called Associates in Art. Okay? And when I took that class, it was back in '96, which sounds like it was 20 years ago, right? Doesn't sound that long to me, right? I was able to take this class. There were a couple people in that class too, which back then weren't really popular. Steve Silver, John Navarez, okay, a couple other buddies of mine that were in there learning, okay? And one of the things that Paul Felix did is he talked about drawing organics. He talked about the beauty of drawing rocks, understanding plants and trees, and guess what else? Besides plant and trees and rocks, understanding, which we'll get to this a little bit later, it's more advanced, the shadows that organics cast. There's something beautiful about the way a shadow can cast down onto a particular object. If we look up here really quick, sorry, let me try to zoom in here. Oh, I was worried that would happen. Hold on, I got to go back up. There we go, and then there we go. Look at the way, see how he drew that rock, and he just imagine up here outside of the frame, there was light coming through and there's a shadow of a tree on there. That's something really beautiful because our little minds notice that. Our little computers that are always running, we come across these little elements and we see these things very quickly. Okay, we realize, oh, that's realistic. That's shadows from leaves casting over a particular rock. Shadows are great because why? Shadows mean two things. Number one, it means that there's a dedicated light source that's coming into the picture that makes the world feel realistic. And number two, we can use shadows to our benefit to cast over perspective ground planes and other objects to help indicate that the perspective is correct in a given situation. Okay, super fantastic. Here are some notes from Paul. Good old Paul Felix. All right. talking about foliage, trees, and vegetation. Okay, so after your first 2 pages, once we start drawing with a horizon line, I want you to start thinking some of the best organics. You can do fish and some other creatures, but I also want you to think about trees and bushes and plants and gnarly looking old trees you might find in the South. That's a little bit harder to draw, okay, with a little bit more information required. But here's some great notes from Paul. Trees and vegetation. Foliage presents a variety of problems in layout and in drawing. Okay, it's easy to forget plants appear in perspective like everything else. For example, many plant forms in nature are highly irregular and complex, and a natural temptation is to give up and copy what is seen in life. Okay, typically this results in vegetation that looks pasted on, overly attentive, grabbing and out of step with the rest of the drawing. It is important to remember that everything, including plants, must go through an editing process before being drawn. You're abstracting the natural world and putting on paper those symbols that express the feeling of real objects. Remember, too, your grid patterns and how trees and shrubs sit on the land. You can use them to provide clues about the ground plane, right? The ground plane, meaning it's that perspective typology plane that exists. We haven't talked too much about that in this class, have we? I've been talking a little bit about it in some of my other classes, and we can talk about that a little bit more, but that's basically our ground plane. Is you need to think of it as where the horizon line is. It is a series of pieces of yarn that are dropped onto the ground that indicate the curvature of what's happening. I can draw that for you in just a second in the demo that I'm going to do, okay? But most important, so look at these examples. Here's a real basic tree. Here's like a squared off hedge. Here's something more organic. Here's something much more contour. Do you see the line change happening in here inside those sketches? And then this is really great right here, is that when we take a look at this, when we're sketching a tree, this is sort of the process that he put up. I can put this on the blog for you too. Okay, look at this, folks. You see what that is? What's that? There's a horizon line there. What's on the horizon line? A square. What's inside the square? An ellipse. And then what he does is he goes up here and he draws that long tube, which is the base of the tree. What's inside that tube? A series of ellipses varying in perspective, and the ellipses are changing and getting greater. And then as he draws, so what's this called, folks? We just talked about it, going that direction. X-axis, right? This is what? Y-axis. So then when we draw something going into depth, that's what? That's the Z. So do you see this? Receding away from us, going into Z. He's then wrapping that with rubber bands and little interior lines to give it dimensional shape. And then what happens when you bring something forward towards us? That's also the Z-axis, right? That's right. Because the Z goes away from us and comes towards us. So then we start to wrap that with lines as well. Okay? In figure drawing, we have a term for that in drawing. What do we call that? When something is coming towards us. We call it foreshortening. Okay? That's right. So when we look, that's a simple line there with simple little, what I was drawing before a couple minutes ago in Sketchbook Pro for you guys, right? Thinking about the shapes. Then look at this. These masses up here, these pluming masses. I like to think of trees as balloons with squashed up shapes on them, with like jelly beans. What are some other good meltable candies? Large jelly beans, maybe round soft marshmallows. Can you think of any? What about ding-dongs? You guys know what a ding-dong is? Twinkie? Have you ever seen a tree in the shape of a Twinkie? I have. I got a neighbor that has one of those trees, and he shapes them and curves them, and he has like the iron mesh around it, and then the gardeners cut over them, and they're all like funky looking, right? Absolutely. So I hate to say these terms, but if you enlarge something that's small, like a jelly bean, okay, look at this. Those are like big, giant, meltable jelly beans. What about a jelly bean made out of marshmallow? I know that sounds funny, but the jelly bean shape, but if it was a marshmallow and rounded and smooth, what would happen if it was very heavy? You would get what to it? Sag. That's right, you would get sag. That is a principle of weight and weight distribution, right? So when you're drawing some organic shapes, like the flippers on the back of a goldfish, or you're drawing a tree with a limb, what are these objects going to be subject to? Gravity, that's right. So if you have a tree that's pulling over to one side, you're going to have the foliage of the tree. If I have a tree that's arcing like this, like half of a U shape, okay? I'm going to have the foliage going all the way off to the right side, and it's going to be dragging towards the ground. Gravity is my friend. When I do drawings of environments or detailed worlds, going in there and being able to show how gravity is affecting the scene is another little golden secret. How can I do that? By having rope hanging across, right? By having fabric hanging down, okay? By having a tree or a plant in the foreground with leaves and little elements hanging down. Even better yet, I call it transition of movement. What happens if I draw a leaf and make it look like that leaf had fallen off from the tree and fell like this at an angle and landed down on the ground plane? Does that make sense? By incorporating little elements like that into a drawing, it makes my drawings look very real. Anyway, back to this. Follow the steps, okay? And then from here, he gets just the basic shapes. From here, he starts to come out and carve out part of the foliage of the tree, which is part of the texture pattern. See that? Each tree has a different type of a texture. Have you ever seen a maple leaf? Maple leaf are really big. And then, I can't think of another tree. A pine tree is needles, right? So you can't draw those two trees in the same shape, okay? The same texture pattern, they're different. A maple leaf is going to be much more fuller when it's patterned together versus a pine tree leaf, you're going to have these skinny little blocks that come off, almost look like a porcupine, okay? So then when he gets to here, and then what he starts to do is he starts to carve out of that shape, and he's accentuating not only the exterior contour line of the object, but now he's putting texture in there to give you a better feel of what the tree is actually doing. Okay? All right. So what I was going to do is I'm going to wrap up this demo real quick. Let me come back into Sketchbook Pro. Those are some basic shapes. I want you to start sketching organic. Have fun. I want you to fill a page of 11 by 17. Please make sure you are drawing through the shape. Don't come back here and give me stuff that's missing this. I want to see those lines cutting through. I want to see center lines, okay? If you want, I can even save this image right here and talk about, this was drawing from the ground up, okay? This was center line on object. So basically what I just showed you were three different ways to draw in organics. One was coming in here and using a dedicated center line and figuring out where that center line is going and how that is working. Okay. Number two was drawing from the ground up. Number three was from drawing with cross sections. Okay. All right, so I don't know if you guys realize that, but I sort of threw that at you real quick in three different variants to how I approach those, okay? Here, what I'm going to do really quick is just with a red line, I'm going to come back up on top here, and I'm going to draw. When I started this shape here, one of the first things that I did was I threw down a shape, and I was talking about the importance of this. You can just see my lines very light in there, of that gesture line, right? Starting with the gesture. I love gesture. Gesture is a way for me to get action of an animal or character or person or tree, okay? On this, I started by thinking about, I didn't mean to, but I erased some of it. I started like this, and I had the baseline there. Here, I started this with this. Now, your drawing doesn't have to be perfect. You can easily make mistakes and then add to it later. And when I started drawing my form here, later on I came back and then I started defining what these elements were, right? In the demo, okay? So look, when I drew this here, I drew it with a series of cross sections. Now, something else I did on this drawing, okay, outside of drawing with cross sections, what did I do? Did you guys see me do this a little bit? When I threw this cross section in right here, oops, that was really, when I threw that cross section in, I did this. I don't know if you guys caught it, but I went to the center right here, and I went like that really lightly. I drew a line, okay? So I'm going to explain that to you. Why did Phil do that? Well, it's a habit I learned from an old figure drawing instructor that I had, which is, his name is Mr. Egan. He taught here at this school. And here's one of the things Mr. Egan taught me about understanding how to draw arms. He says if you draw that circle shape, and then you draw the line in the direction in which the arm is going back, it gives you an understanding of how to draw that cylinder shape. And then once you get that, you have the elbow. And then once you have the elbow, you have the forearm. And then if you bring that line back, you have the ability to then come in here and then draw that forearm shape. And then you can come back in here. By the way, this is going to be one of our topics we're going to cover soon. We're going to be drawing the human mannequin from multiple positions to the point to where you can draw it out of your head in multiple positions. Okay? You see how I drew that arm right there? And then look, that base was the soul, that's the shoulder. So that's an arm right there. So what would happen if Phil goes back over, let's say I do it in the other direction. Let's say I start here, and I'm going to bring that Z depth towards me, right? So do you see how I did that here when I was drawing? I put a little line here, sometimes at the base, sometimes I do it like this. If I'm on a ground plane, like if I have a tree leg like this, I draw a line like that, and then I come over and I just imagine the thickness of the tree as it's turning. But basically what I'm doing is I'm connecting a point to the base of all these. Do you see that? And then what I do from there is I then connect the lines. And then I can come in here and just throw a couple cross contours going over, and I can start to get into a little bit of hatching detail to indicate that that is part of a tree leg that's coming. Do you see how that could be part of a tree leg? And then it comes over here and connects to the base of a tree. Okay? And then tree legs are part of a branch mechanism. So branch mechanisms, like our human body, branch out from one to usually in primes. Okay? So for example, here's your shoulder, right? Your shoulder, you come down from here. Does anyone know what this bone is right here on the arm?
Femur?
Femur's on your leg. Huh? Tibula's on your leg. Well, I'm zooming out right now. And I actually know it, but I just had a brain fart. I know the other ones. Okay, because what happens, that'll come to me in a second. I'm having a brain fart. But this is how the human body works, right? We come down here, we have one. Then we come down here and we get radius, and we get ulna. And then from radius and ulna, then we have a series of wrist knuckles. And then so we went from 1, and then we go to 2. And then from here, we end up with then a series of base supports, and then we end up with, and then these base supports, right, make up the base of the hand, okay, that connect. And then from here, we have the series of knuckles, and then we dive into a whole other series of phalange bones. So we go from 1 to 3 to 5 to about, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, about another 4 to 5 sections of bones then coming out. Call this a branching system. It exists in all of nature. It never changes. So what does that mean for the tree? Well, the tree base of this tree was right in here, right? That's part of a root. So when that root comes out, then we come back to another line here like this, and then we have another branch that comes out of that tree, part of the stem of the base of the trunk, right? And then that will branch out. Like so. Like so. And it gets smaller and smaller. Just like Another example in the human body. Ready? Heart. I know it's a horrible heart, right? And then you have the main valves come off that heart, right? But then what happens, you have a main vein that comes off. That separates into another vein, which separates into another vein, which separates into another series of veins, and then those separate into other veins, and that's how we bring blood throughout the human body, right? It's a branching system. It's the same principle. So when I draw trees and I start getting into organic elements, I'm thinking of this branching system. I'm thinking about how I go from one key shape, which is over right here. Let me erase that. I start thinking about one key shape in here, and then I start thinking about the roots and how the roots spread out into a branching system. Okay? But how did I draw this? The way that I drew this. Okay? I drew two ways. Number one, when I'm drawing with cross sections, I draw a line on the ground, then I draw a series of cross sections. Sorry, it's getting squiggly. And then I connect those cross sections together to make that, or I start from the middle like I did here in my figure drawing example, and I draw a line going from the middle of a cross section to another, and then I come back over here and I connect those across, and then I wrap these guys with a couple more rubber bands or shapes, okay? They're both the same approach, they're just two different modes of thinking. And the difference is I drop this on the ground plane, I drop this line right here, I'm going to darken it. I do that, when does a fill do that? I put that line when I'm drawing on a ground plane or a dedicated typology surface. Does that make sense? The other one, I do, this arm, I do that when I have something free floating in the air, like an arm. So if I have someone's arm coming towards me, I come from here, I draw that, and then maybe their arm's pointing upward and they're like waving, so I draw the elbow. And I come in here, I find that center. I come up here, I draw that. And then I come here and I draw the mannequin's hand. Connected to that. Does that make sense? Oops. Slip. So you see how that's an arm right there? Connected to a shoulder. So I can start drawing, that's what we're going to get into next. That's when we start combining 1 point and 2 point combined with, we have to be able to draw the human figure from multiple positions from our brain. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and stop there for right now because I think the video's already gone a little high. But I'm going to give you a minute and I'll update the blog for you guys. And I'm going to put on here what I want you to do. You're going to have 5 pages again this week. Okay, and it's sort of similar to the tier and the props. We're going to start with really simple organic shapes like this. Okay, and remember this. I'm going to have this demo. I'll link up the demo. We have, man, I can't draw today on this Cintiq. I don't know why. It keeps slipping everywhere. We have the center line of an object. We have drawing from the ground up, and we have cross sections. Okay, that apply to part of our drawing. I'll label that on the blog. In fact, I'll save that image and put it up there if that helps you guys. Okay, let me end the demo right now because I know it's getting up there. What are we at, time-wise? Uh-oh. Where's the recorder?